All right, False Gods by Graham McNeil is the follow-up to Horus Rising in the Horus Heresy series, and I got some major problems with this one.
Yeah, editor, if you want to put a cool intro video here, that'd be cool. Thank you.
Well, how's it going, everyone? Nico here. Today, we have False Gods by Graham McNeil. It's the second book to the Horus Heresy series, and if you're like me, you just finished the Horus Rising book, and you're like, man, I'm excited to hop into this rest of this Horus Heresy series, and you're wondering, hey, is this going to be worth it, or is anything else going to be as good as that first book? And you know, whenever I first read Horus Rising, I didn't have that high of expectations, truth be told. I didn't think that the writing quality was going to be that great. I thought it was just going to be cool Warhammer stuff, and it's going to be at least entertaining. But in that book, I found the characters to be quite deep. I thought there was gravitas to every single kind of situation. There was a unique quality to every single character. They each seemed to have their own unique voice. And then also, you know, Horus being the main figure sort of person in this series had so much more charisma than I had anticipated, and was someone that you could really see people rooting for or following or being loyal to. And so Horus Rising was such a phenomenal surprise, and I thought that book is incredible. And so I was looking forward to False Gods because I was like, okay, maybe it's going to be just as good, or maybe it's going to be better. We'll see. And as I read it, I did not feel that way. Whenever I first started prepping my review for this, I actually started prepping it about halfway through. I started writing down my ideas and my thoughts because I had to. I had just too much to say about really the first half of this book. By the time I got to the end, I will say my feelings changed a little bit. And so I was fully prepared to rip this book a new one. And not like literally, but I was ready to just trash this book. There are a lot of things I don't like about this, but before we get into the negatives, I do want to say there are quite a few positives within False Gods. The positives for False Gods. False Gods has sort of it's sort of what I expected before I got into Horus Rising. I expected not the greatest writing. I expected it just to be really cool Warhammer ideas and lore and action, and that's pretty much ultimately what I feel like you get with False Gods. I think the Warhammer of this is quite entertaining, and it also, by the time I finished it, I said, okay, well, I do want to read more and see where this kind of goes. So I was considering dropping False Gods about midway through, and I was also considering dropping the Horus Heresy almost in its entirety as I started reading False Gods. But with that being said, I think it's entertaining. If you like Warhammer stuff, there is cool Warhammer stuff in this. The problem being is I feel like the cool Warhammer stuff really takes up about the last quarter of this book. Some of it dips a little bit earlier into it, but this book definitely feels like it was almost written backwards. It's like, hey, we know where we're trying to get, but we don't really know how to get there. And so that's where a lot of the negatives start to kind of come in. And so if you are into Warhammer, if you're liking the stuff, I do suggest reading it. I think it is good enough to read, or worth a read. But the negatives, let's hop into them. And I will keep this spoiler free, just for anyone who hasn't read it and is trying to see whether or not they want to. But I'm going to get into a little bit more of kind of the quality of this. I'm not going to give any actual spoilers away, but there are some things that have to be addressed a little bit. So the writing quality of False Gods compared to Horus Rising, I think, is a major dip. I'm not much of a reader, as I've said in every single one of my videos, but I do feel like while I was reading this, it was the first time I've ever read something and said, this feels weird. This feels strange. This feels almost hollow. It feels shallow. It feels like I'm only getting the words of surface level ideas or emotions happening within the book. And so it feels like quite a dip, especially considering the kind of gravitas that Horus Rising has. What Dan Abnett was able to kind of accomplish with that, especially with things like the Mournival and sort of those characters and their relationships. Like each character kind of felt like a unique character. But before I get ahead of myself with those characters, we do have this shallow sort of writing that, and maybe this might explain it to you a little bit more. There's so many redundancies in this book when it comes to the writing. And as someone who comes from more of a movie writing world, a screenplay sort of world, cutting out redundancies is a huge thing. You don't want to repeat things that you said right before, unless you're trying to go deeper into that emotion. There are multiple moments in this book where the narration will say something along the lines of, and this character was scared. And then the very next line of the dialogue will be that character saying, I'm scared. I don't know why, but that frustrates me to no end, because it doesn't give us any depth to the feeling that they're having. You could either just use the narration and say that they were terrified, or you could have the person say, I'm scared, and kind of go into that and explain it. We didn't get an actual deepening or understanding of a lot of these characters' feelings or motivations or fears, and it all just kind of stayed at that surface level. And so that kind of stuff for me was a real bummer, because I legit would sit here and I would get mad. There are times where I was reading and I cringed and I closed the book and I said, man, how do I continue reading this? And that kind of sucks. As well as because you stay at that shallow level, what I was talking about earlier, the lack of gravitas, the lack of weight for these characters, not only is the writing kind of lacking depth, it means that the characters ultimately end up lacking depth. And, this might just be me, but whenever I read Horus Rising, the way those characters are written, I could hear a different voice for each and every character in my head. They didn't feel the same. This, on the other hand, everyone sort of feels the same. It all kind of feels like the same voice throughout, for the most part. I will say that switches up a little bit at the end. I think there's some good character development towards the end of the book, but I mean, I had to go back multiple times and just kind of look back and see, okay, well, who said that again? I'm not sure who I'm reading, because it all sounds the same. And so it's also kind of inconsistent tonally. Like there are multiple parts where a character will demand a group of people to be quiet, or they'll demand them to kind of stay on their toes, and then that character who's demanding them to lock in just starts yapping, just starts talking, or everyone else just starts talking, and he doesn't say, hey, lock in more. They start having another conversation that isn't about what's directly in front of them. And so what's the point of saying, hey, we need to be serious, if you're not going to make them be serious? There are a couple of things. This book is definitely false gods, and we know what the Horus Heresy is about. If you've kind of know anything about Warhammer, it is about the fall of Horus, and this is about characters changing and characters kind of falling from grace. But I do think there are elements of that are approved or achieved well in this. But what I'm talking about in terms of the inconsistency of the characters doesn't necessarily have to do with that. It has to do with their situational awareness. Just feels so off. Like these are, we're following the Astartes, we're following the Sons of Horus in this, and they feel so clueless. Like every single one of them does. And it's weird because like there is a moment where a character, a very pivotal character, is hurt or in danger in this. So much so that everyone kind of throws safety or kind of, I don't know, compassion to the wind, and they're like, we're going to do whatever we can to save this person. It is a dire, dire situation. And so you think in that there'd be a sense of urgency in everything that they did. And there is that. But the next moment, they start kind of just talking. They start taking things slow. It's like, hey, remember this guy that might be dying? We should make sure we're hurrying up and trying to get back there. Like, that felt super inconsistent. And then also the characters that are trying to be like, hey, this is serious, then kind of starts joking around a little bit, like right after, and it's just like, what are we doing here? The quality of the writing, whoops, is just not as good. It's just not as good as Horus Rising. Overall, the Warhammer of it is good. It's fun. I think if this was the first of the Horus Heresy series, I'm not sure if I would have continued reading this series. I do think what Dan Abnett was able to achieve in Horus Rising was such a solid character foundation that it's really hard to kind of live up to it for another writer. And I haven't read anything else by Graham McNeill, and I don't want to say that he's not a good writer, but something felt lost in like the editing of this, or it just felt like we have this one really good idea and we know where we're trying to get, but we're really just struggling to get there. And this book is just a mess. Like, it is a mess. It is a mix of some decent, cool Warhammer stuff and some just writing that infuriated me to no end. Do I recommend it? If you're really bought into the Warhammer stuff, come on. Yeah, you read it. Of course you do. Maybe you continue it on. But if you are someone who's like more of just a fan of literature, or fan of books, and you're maybe dipping your toes into Warhammer, I don't know if I do recommend this, because if you don't care about what happens later with Horus, or what happens later within this universe, I think you're just going to be frustrated by the writing in it, truth be told. So if you're a Warhammer fan, hop into it. If you're not, then I think you shouldn't waste your time with it, because I do think the writing is just subpar. I think Horus Rising, I think everyone should read that. I think that's great. I think if you're not into Warhammer, I think it's still a good read. You may need to do a little bit of research to figure out, okay, like, is this, like, for everything to have the weight that it needs to, you have to have an understanding of a little bit of an understanding of the Emperor and Horus and kind of that setting to fully get everything out of it. But I think the writing of that is really good, so it's worth reading. This is just, man. I thought I was gonna not finish it. I really thought I was gonna quit that book. Up until just about the end. In the end, I was like, okay, cool, awesome, I'm here. You got me. But it was a struggle of a read for me, especially considering like I just finished The Way of Kings, and I finished that book in 2 weeks time, and I finished this in 3 or 4 days, and I feel like I should have been able to knock this out in 2 or 3 if it really hooked me, and it just didn't. It was just I did not look forward to reading more of it as I was reading it, up until, the last quarter or so of the book. But yeah, so that's my review of False Gods. Have you read it? Let me know what you think. If you haven't, I don't know why you're here, but I mean, I guess that's the point of the video. But if you haven't, let me know what you thought of like Horus Rising, and if you're excited to hop into False Gods. But for now, that's all. Take it easy.